Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Acting President. Mr. Acting President, this bill about the treaty is certainly, I think, is the most important legislation to come before us this week, and possibly the most important legislation to come before this Parliament, because this is another step along the road that must be taken. This and the voice to Parliament indicate the direction we're going, and it's a welcome direction, because if we do not take these steps, we will live as a backward country. And Mr. President, you know, I also acknowledge the Indigenous forebears, the original inhabitants and owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people, and pay respect to their elders past and present and future. And everyone says this now at the beginning of speeches, or nearly everyone, but we've got to go further than that, further than just paying respects and acknowledging. We've got to really take on board the spirit of our Indigenous community and recognise it and incorporate it in our way of life, because this is so important. You know, we talk about Australians, and the Indigenous people of Australia are the true Australians. We're all migrants, or our forebears are migrants, unless we've got Aboriginal blood flowing through our veins. You know, my ancestors came here 5 generations ago. Half of Australia's population, their ancestors came here a mere generation ago. And the Aboriginal people go back hundreds of generations before that. We don't know how far back, but a long way back. And they've cared for and nurtured this land for all that time. And we've only come here recently, and the settlers have become the power here. There were wars fought, and Mr. Medic read out an attitude of an early governor that this was war, and it was conducted in a bloodthirsty manner, and all this is part of our history. It's a history we must acknowledge and teach this history. We must acknowledge Aboriginal history and teach that. You know, not only you know, take very much on board what Dr. Bark was pointing out earlier in his opening remarks to this bill, the importance of teaching this history. You know, history post 1788, when the colonisers came here, and also the history before that, the Dreamtime and all that, is extremely important for us to understand and incorporate into our life, because this is Australian history and it goes back a long way. This is the way to understand and respect Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal knowledge that is so important. We should be teaching Aboriginal language at schools, because if kids learn the language, they learn the culture too. It's most important, and we're just scratching the surface in making progress here. I mean, really, the runs aren't on the board, as Dr. Ratnam and Dr. Bark were talking about earlier. You know, we've still got Aboriginal, you know, children being removed from their homes at a high rate, and although Indigenous people only make up 2 or 3% of the current population, they're represented by 25% of them. They make up 25% of the prisoners in jail. There is something wrong with our social and legal systems that aren't working, and let's hope that this process of incorporating Aboriginal ideas and Aboriginal issues into our daily discourse through this process really starts to bring about change. Now, I had the privilege and have learnt a hell of a lot from being on the Planning and Environment Committee and sitting, especially on the Habitat distraction and species extinction inquiry that we did. And we heard from many Aboriginal groups over those inquiries. And the one thing that comes through from hearing from Aboriginal people is that what they put first and foremost is care of this land and the love of the land. And, you know, I come from, my party is the Sustainable Australia Party, and we talk about preserving the Australian land for future generations. This is what we want to do. And we hear that that is what Aboriginal people have been doing, and that is how they have lived upon this land. And yet when we came as colonisers, we came with a extractive and exploitative attitude to the land, like colonisers, like we were coming here to take as much wealth out of the land as we could and go back to where we came from. But we're not going back to where we came from. This is our land. We've got to take care of it too. And the only people that came forward with reasonable, practical ways of managing or looking to manage into the future were the Indigenous people. They talked about ways of land management and water management that would work into the future. And this really didn't come from the submitters that were representing other interests. And if other submitters, that were coming from the group of people that were the descendants of the colonisers, they were talking of the Aboriginal ideas that they'd picked up in land management in Australia. So it's just so important for us to take on board Aboriginal ways of land management, and to do that we've got to understand the culture and the history. All that is so important. So I look forward to great promise coming out of the treaty that we're trying to set up, and this is really just the beginning of that. And I think we've got a lot to learn from the Indigenous people of our country, and I would like to see that become incorporated into our ways of going about our business, our relationships in Australia, especially our relationship to the land and how we can care for it. You know, the great myth of terra nullius, we all know it was nonsense now, that they weren't here, or if they were here, they didn't do anything to look after the land, so we could come in and teach them how to farm it and how to mine it. And it's absolutely ridiculously arrogant. But we talk about the golden age of the 1800s in Australia, Australia Felix, that my grandfather, I come from a farming family. My grandfather made a good living out of this land as a sheep farmer here. But we were living off the bank of what the Aboriginal people had done. They had nurtured the grasslands. They had built up the topsoil. They had looked after the water. They had managed the forestry so it wasn't a dense, bushy undergrowth the way it is now. All this had been done, and we benefited from that. But pretty soon we started running it down, and we see the damage all over the place, that we have to change our practices. So I look forward to a lot of that coming out of this. I've already heard a lot in our inquiries that we need to do a hell of a lot more in the way of looking after our species, our Indigenous species that are on decline. We have to pay close attention to climate change and how we manage the landscape and water. All of this, we talk about at a high level, but we don't do enough practically. And we've got to really take that Aboriginal knowledge on board at the lower levels and get that knowledge incorporated into how we go about things. Not just say, well, okay, you fellas, thanks for turning up, and you sit to one side while we do it our way. So I have great hopes for this. So this is probably the most important bill to come before us in this session. And probably next to my, it comes in front of, but my Wake Up to Climate Change bill is also very important to our country. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Very good.